There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a friend beside you on a worn-out couch. You don't recognize them as watershed events at the time. There is no thunderclap, no dramatic swell of music. There is only the subtle shift of air in the room, a change in pressure you feel deep in your bones, telling you that the landscape of your life, the one you had so carefully mapped, has just been irrevocably altered. For me, that moment was not a sound, but a touch so featherlight and tentative that it could have been an accident, a phantom limb of my own imagination. But it was real, and it was followed by a question whispered into the space between us, a question that hung in the dim light like a mote of dust, containing the weight of a universe. We were on the couch, a familiar geography for us in those months. The television murmured in the corner, casting flickering blue and orange light across the room, a silent narrator to our own quiet drama. It was late. Rain was beginning to tap against the window panes, a gentle, percussive rhythm that seemed to be counting down to something I couldn't yet name. Liam was beside me, his long frame stretched out, his head resting on the armrest. I thought he was asleep. He had been for the better part of an hour, his breathing falling into the slow, deep cadence of genuine rest, a state that had become increasingly rare for him. My own body was a statue of careful stillness. He had shifted in his sleep about 20 minutes prior, rolling slightly toward me, and his leg had come to rest against mine, from knee to ankle. It was a line of heat, a current of electricity that I had been trying to ignore with every ounce of my self-control. I had spent years mastering the art of being near Liam without betraying the frantic, desperate fluttering in my chest. It was a form of high-wire act, performed daily, in the privacy of our shared apartment. My world, for the past 4 years, had been a study in containment. I was a photographer, and I suppose my entire way of being was about framing things. I would take the vast, chaotic landscape of my feelings for Liam and crop it down to something manageable, friendship. I would put it behind glass, hang it on the wall of my mind, and admire it for what it was, never daring to touch the print for fear of smudging it. The rules were simple. Do not stare too long. Do not read into his casual touches. Do not mistake his easy affection for anything more than the platonic camaraderie he offered so freely to everyone. And above all, do not hope. Hope was the chemical that could overexpose the image, bleaching it into a meaningless white void. I had built a fortress of these rules, and for a long time, it had kept me safe. But then, everything had started to change. The fortress had begun to show cracks. The change had a name, and its name was Liam's exhaustion. The change had a texture, and it was the worn corduroy of this couch. It had a sound, and it was the soft sigh he'd let out as he finally surrendered to sleep night after night. And now, the change had a new, terrifying motion. His hand, which had been lying limp on his own stomach, moved. It was a slow drift, an almost imperceptible journey across the small continent of denim that separated us. I watched it from the corner of my eye, my heart beginning a frantic, panicked beat against my ribs, a trapped bird wanting out. It settled on my thigh. It didn't grab or hold. It just rested there, the palm a small patch of impossible warmth. I stopped breathing. The rain picked up its tempo outside. The actors on the screen were shouting about some forgotten betrayal, but their voices were a distant, meaningless buzz. The only reality was the weight of his hand. For a full minute, nothing happened. It just rested there. My mind raced, trying to file this event into a pre-existing category. Sleep movement. Accident. Unconscious twitch. I was a frantic librarian trying to shelve a book that didn't fit into any known section of the library. It was too deliberate for an accident, too still for a twitch. He was asleep, I told myself. He had to be. It was the only explanation that allowed my carefully constructed world to remain intact. And then, his fingers moved. A slow, deliberate drag of his index finger, tracing a small, lazy circle on the rough fabric of my jeans. The motion was so slight, yet it sent a jolt through my entire nervous system, a low-voltage shock that made every muscle in my body clench. The circle was no bigger than a coin, but it felt like he was mapping a new galaxy on my skin. He drew it again, and a third time. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. He was not asleep. The knowledge landed not like a feather, but like an anvil. He was awake, and he was consciously, deliberately, touching me in a way that defied every platonic definition in our shared history. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. My carefully maintained composure, the product of years of practice, was dissolving like sugar in water. I was entirely exposed, my thoughts running wild and untamed. What did this mean? Was this a joke? A test? A dream? I remained perfectly still, a prey animal hoping the predator would lose interest if it didn't move. I felt his thumb join the index finger, a gentle, almost questioning pressure. The circle stopped. His hand just lay there, a silent, heavy question mark. And then he spoke. His voice was a low murmur, rough with sleep, and something else I couldn't identify. It was so quiet I almost missed it, a sound meant only for the few inches of air between us. Do you think about me? The question was not a seduction. It was not a come on. It was raw and terribly vulnerable. It was the sound of a person standing on a precipice, asking if the ground on the other side was real. All the air in the universe seemed to have been vacuumed out of our small living room. My fortress of rules, my carefully framed photographs of friendship, my entire strategy for survival, it all crumbled to dust in the space of that one, whispered question. It was the most terrifying and beautiful sound I had ever heard. Because the answer, the real answer, was a tidal wave held back by the thinnest of dams. I think about you all the time. I think about you when I'm framing a shot, and the light hits a certain way that reminds me of your eyes. I think about you when I'm in the darkroom, and the loneliness feels like a physical presence. I think about you so much that I've forgotten what it feels like to have a thought that isn't, in some way, connected to you. But I couldn't say that. The risk was too great. The fall from this precipice was too far. So I just sat there, frozen in the flickering light, with the weight of his hand on my leg and the weight of his question in my heart, and I couldn't find a single word. To understand the sheer magnitude of that moment, you have to understand the foundation it was built upon. You have to understand the 4 years that preceded it, the architecture of our friendship, and the silent, one-sided covenant I had made with myself. I met Liam during my sophomore year of college. I was a ghost in the arts building, haunting the photography labs and the darkroom, my hands perpetually smelling of fixer. My world was one of f-stops, shutter speeds, and the patient magic of watching an image emerge from a blank sheet of paper. I was quiet, not out of shyness, but out of a preference for observation. I preferred listening to the world rather than adding to its noise. Liam was the opposite of a ghost. He was pure, undiluted presence. He was a software engineering major, but he had the energy and charisma of a campus politician. He was loud, not in an obnoxious way, but in a way that just naturally drew people into his orbit. He was the sun. I was a bit of rock and ice orbiting from a safe, unnoticed distance. We ended up in the same senior year seminar, a ridiculously named interdisciplinary course called The Architecture of Ideas. It was one of those classes designed to be an easy credit, but it forced us into a group project. By some fluke of alphabetical seating, I was grouped with Liam and 2 other students whose names I've long since forgotten. Our project was to design a conceptual space for living. The other 2 members contributed next to nothing. I found myself paired with the campus Sun King, and I was terrified. I expected him to either take over completely or coast on his charm while I did all the work. He did neither. Instead, he listened. I would talk, in my hesitant, roundabout way, about how a home wasn't just walls and a roof, but a collection of sight lines, of how light moved through a room over the course of a day, of how a doorway was both a barrier and an invitation. I expected him to be bored. Instead, he was fascinated. He would lean in, his bright, intelligent eyes fixed on me, and ask questions. He didn't understand the artistic language, but he understood systems. He translated my abstract concepts about light and emotion into logical flows and user experiences. So the entryway is like an API, he'd said once. It needs to be a clear, well-documented point of entry that tells the user what to expect from the rest of the system. It was the nerdiest, most ridiculously charming thing I'd ever heard. We spent late nights in the library, our table a chaotic mess of my sketches and his flowcharts. We discovered a shared, absurd sense of humor and a mutual love for terrible late-night diners. I learned that beneath his sunny, extroverted exterior was a deeply analytical and surprisingly thoughtful person. He learned that beneath my quiet, observational shell was, well, I'm not sure what he learned, but he kept showing up. We got an A on the project. At the end of the semester, when we were all scrambling for post-graduation plans, he was the one who proposed the idea. His consulting job was based here, and my freelance photography career meant I could live anywhere. His current roommates were graduating and moving away. He had a line on a decent two-bedroom apartment not far from campus. It was a purely practical suggestion, a logical solution to a logistical problem. My heart, however, is not a logical organ. It heard the suggestion as a lifeline. The thought of my life without his easy laughter and brilliant mind had been a growing ache in my chest, and he had just offered a reprieve. I said yes before he had even finished the sentence. Living with him was both easier and harder than I ever could have imagined. Easier, because our rhythms just clicked. He was neat, respectful of my strange hours, and seemed to genuinely enjoy my company. He'd come home from a long day at work, drop his bag by the door, and the first thing he'd do was find me, whether I was editing photos at the kitchen table or just reading in my room. He'd lean in the doorway, that familiar, lopsided grin on his face, and ask about my day. He made me feel seen. He made our apartment feel like a home, not just a place we split rent. Harder, because every day was a lesson in unrequited love. The sheer, casual intimacy of sharing a space with him was a slow, sweet torture. Seeing his ridiculous collection of mismatched socks on the laundry room floor. The way he'd hum off-key while making coffee in the morning. The times he'd come out of the shower, a towel slung low on his hips, hair dripping, completely oblivious to the way my breath would catch in my throat. I fell in love with him not in a single moment, but in 1,000 tiny, mundane ones. It was a gradual accretion, like a pearl forming around a piece of grit. The grit was the hope I couldn't seem to kill, and the pearl was the beautiful, painful, secret love I built around it. He would date, of course. He'd go on a few dates with someone, bring her back to the apartment once or twice. They were always nice, smart, beautiful women, and I would be polite. I would retreat to my room, the designated darkroom of my emotional life, and I would put on my headphones and try to pretend the low murmur of their voices wasn't a physical pain. None of them ever lasted long. Liam had a restlessness about him, a low-grade dissatisfaction I could never quite put my finger on. After a breakup, he'd be a little quieter for a week, a little more subdued. He'd seek out my company more, suggesting a movie or a trip to our old diner. And in those moments, that stupid, traitorous grit of hope would start to gleam again, and I would have to bury it all over again. That was our normal. That was the stable, predictable orbit I had settled into. I was his best friend, his roommate, his constant. And I had accepted that. I had framed that reality, hung it on the wall, and told myself it was enough. It had to be enough, because the alternative, confessing my feelings and losing him entirely, was unthinkable. It would be like the sun suddenly vanishing from the sky. The cold, the dark, the absolute emptiness of it. I couldn't survive that. So I kept my silence. I built my fortress of rules. I became an expert in the art of loving from a safe distance, of admiring the warmth without ever letting myself get burned. For 3.5 years, the system worked. The fortress held. I was safe. I was lonely, but I was safe. And then came the project in Chicago. It was a massive undertaking for his company, and Liam was the lead. For 6 months, he was more gone than he was home. He'd fly out on a Monday morning and come back late on a Friday night, his face etched with exhaustion. Our apartment grew quiet. The silence in his absence was different from the comfortable silence we shared. It was an empty, hollow thing. I found myself leaving a light on in the living room for him on Friday nights. A small, silent welcome. When he was home on weekends, he was a ghost of himself. He'd sleep for 12 hours straight and still look tired. We'd talk, but his mind was always elsewhere, already troubleshooting some problem 1,000 miles away. He was stressed, but it was the stress of ambition, of creation. He was building something, and it was consuming him. I missed him with an ache that was physical, but I was also proud of him. I saw the fire in his eyes when he talked about the project, the intricate, beautiful system he was designing. The project launched. By all accounts, it was a technical masterpiece. He was supposed to be triumphant. The final Friday, when he was due home for good, I had planned a small celebration. I bought his favorite beer, ordered from the Thai place he loved. I waited. 9 o'clock became 10, then 11. Just as I was starting to worry, his key turned in the lock. The door opened, and he stumbled in. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had been shipwrecked. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. He dropped his bag, and the sound it made was one of utter finality. He just stood there in the doorway, staring at nothing. "Liam?" I asked, my voice soft. He looked up at me, and his eyes were hollow. "They shelved it," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. "The client. A corporate merger. New leadership. They're going in a different direction. 6 months of work, my whole team, just gone. Deleted." He wasn't just tired anymore. He was broken. Something inside him, that bright, burning sun of his, had been extinguished. He walked past me without a word, went into his room, and closed the door. He didn't come out for the rest of the weekend. I would leave food outside his door, and a few hours later, the plate would be gone. On Monday morning, he emerged. He told me he'd taken a leave of absence for a few weeks. He tried to smile, but it was a ghastly, fragile thing. And that's when the new chapter began. That's when the carefully constructed architecture of our friendship began to groan under a new and unbearable strain. That's when he started falling asleep on the couch. It began with an unspoken need. The hollow silence of the apartment, which had been his refuge, now seemed to amplify his sense of failure. He started spending more and more time in the common areas, in the living room where I would be working or reading. He wouldn't talk much. He would just be there, a quiet, wounded presence. His own room, I think, felt like a cage, a place to be alone with his thoughts, and that was the last thing he wanted. He needed an anchor, a fixed point in his spinning world, and for reasons I couldn't and wouldn't let myself fully examine, he had chosen me. One night, we were watching some mindless action movie, a comfortable background noise. I glanced over and saw that his eyes had closed, his head lolling against the back of the couch. He looked so vulnerable, so utterly spent, that an instinct I had long suppressed rose to the surface. I got up quietly, fetched the thick woolen throw from the back of my armchair, and gently draped it over him. His breathing was shallow, his face tight with stress even in sleep. I stood there for a long moment, just watching him, the urge to reach out and smooth the worry from his brow, so strong it made my hand ache. I resisted. That was a line I could not cross. I went to my room, leaving him there in the soft glow of the lamp. The next night, it happened again. We were on the couch, the television a low murmur. This time, as his eyes began to droop, he shifted, turning toward me slightly. He didn't say anything, but the movement felt like a question, a quiet plea. I hesitated for only a second before getting the blanket again. As I tucked it around his shoulders, his eyes fluttered open for a moment. He looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Gratitude? Something more? Before I could decipher it, his eyes slipped closed again. But this time, as I turned to leave, his voice, thick with oncoming sleep, stopped me. "Ethan." I froze, my back to him. "Yeah." There was a pause. "Don't go yet." My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a simple request. A plea against loneliness from a man who was hurting. That's all it was. I told myself that, over and over. I turned back and sat down on the far end of the couch, picking up my book, trying to pretend this was normal. I could feel his presence, his warmth, across the cushions. I didn't read a single word. I just listened to the sound of his breathing as it slowly deepened, a fragile truce with the demons that were chasing him. That night, I waited until I was absolutely sure he was in a deep sleep before I finally retreated to my own room, my own carefully guarded solitude. This became our ritual. Night after night, we would end up on the couch. The pretense of watching a movie or a show would fade away sooner and sooner, until it was just an accepted fact that this was where the day would end. For him, I think, it was a sanctuary. My quiet, steady presence was a bulwark against the chaos in his own head. He didn't have to talk. He didn't have to pretend to be okay. He could just be, and in being, he could rest. For me, it was a paradise and a torture chamber rolled into one. Every night, I was allowed this proximity, this sliver of intimacy that was more than I had ever dared to dream of. And every night, I had to police my own heart, reminding myself of the context. He was my friend. He was hurting. I was a port in a storm. Ports are not destinations. They are temporary shelters. To believe otherwise was to invite disaster. The boundaries began to blur in increments, so small you could barely measure them. A week into our new routine, he fell asleep with his head on the armrest, and in his sleep, he shifted, his arm flopping across the space between us to rest on the cushion right next to my leg. My entire body went rigid. I sat there for an hour, hyper-aware of his knuckles grazing my thigh, telling myself it was an accident. The next night, it wasn't an accident. As he drifted off, he deliberately moved his arm, slinging it over my lap, his hand resting loosely on my far leg. It was a gesture of immense, thoughtless trust. The kind of casual physicality people who are comfortable with each other share. But for me, it was a thunderbolt. The weight of his arm was both a comfort and an agony. I could feel the heat of him through my jeans, could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap. I spent those nights in a state of suspended animation, my senses heightened to an almost painful degree. I was a seismograph, and Liam was a distant, unpredictable tremor. I recorded every shift in his breathing, every twitch of his fingers, every soft sigh. I analyzed them for meaning, for intent, searching for a pattern in the chaos. I started to think of these evenings as developing a photograph in my darkroom. The initial act, him falling asleep on the couch, was the blank paper submerged in the developer. For a long time, nothing would be visible. It was just an empty white sheet, full of potential but giving no clues. Then, slowly, a faint grayness would appear, his arm moving closer. A ghost of an image. Then a line would sharpen, his hand on my leg. The details would start to emerge, slowly resolving themselves out of the chemical bath. But the final image remained unclear. Was it a portrait of friendship in a time of crisis? Or was it something else, something I was terrified to even name? I was so afraid of misinterpreting the image, of seeing what I wanted to see instead of what was actually there. I was so afraid of exposing it to the light too soon and watching it all fade to black. One night, the image developed further than ever before. He had been particularly quiet all day, lost in a fog of his own thoughts. He seemed smaller, somehow, as if his grief were physically compressing him. When we settled on the couch that evening, he didn't even pretend to watch the TV. He just curled up on his side, facing me, and pulled the blanket over himself. I sat with my book, as usual, the lamp by my chair casting a warm, golden circle of light. After about half an hour, I thought he was asleep. He was so still. But then he shifted, inching closer across the vast expanse of the couch, until his forehead was resting gently against my upper arm. He nuzzled into me, a small, sleepy movement, like a child seeking comfort. And he stayed there. His warm breath ghosted against the sleeve of my shirt. I could feel the soft strands of his hair tickling my skin. My book lay forgotten in my lap. My entire being was focused on that single point of contact. This was no longer ambiguous. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate act of seeking closeness, of seeking solace in my physical presence. My mind was a civil war. One side, the hopeful, treacherous side, was screaming with joy. He feels it too. He needs you. This is real. The other side, the cautious, battle-scarred veteran of my heart, was issuing warnings. Don't be a fool. He's using you as a teddy bear. He's emotionally adrift, and you're a convenient anchor. This has nothing to do with you, not the real you. It's about what you represent, stability, safety. Don't mistake proximity for intimacy. I didn't know which side to believe, so I did nothing. I sat there, a living statue, my arm a pillow for the man I loved, and I felt the beautiful, agonizing weight of it all. I was drowning in sensation, the scent of his hair, the sound of his breathing, the warmth of his body seeping into mine. It was everything I had ever wanted, and it was all built on a foundation of ambiguity and pain. His pain and my own long-hidden ache. And that's where we were, weeks later, on that rainy Tuesday night. The ritual had become so ingrained it no longer felt strange. It was just what we did. He would come home, broken from a world that had rejected his best efforts, and I would be his quiet, steadfast harbor. The couch was our shared territory, a liminal space that was neither my room nor his, governed by unspoken rules that were constantly, subtly being rewritten. The line of his leg against mine was now a familiar pressure. But the hand was new. The deliberate journey it had taken across the space between us was a new paragraph in our silent story. And the circles his finger was tracing, That was a new language entirely. It was a language of intention. It spoke of wakefulness, of a conscious choice. And it was this new, terrifying clarity that set the stage for his question. He was awake. He was touching me. And he was asking me to reveal a truth I had spent years hiding. Do you think about me? The question wasn't about my day-to-day thoughts. It wasn't a casual inquiry. It was a deep-sea probe, sent down into the darkest, most protected abyss of my heart. He was asking if I saw him, the real him, beyond the friendship. He was asking if he occupied the same kind of space in my head that I had clearly come to occupy in his. He was asking if this strange, magnetic pull between us was a one-way current. My silence stretched, taut and fragile. The rain tapped against the glass, a nervous finger drumming on a tabletop. In the dim light, I could just make out his face. His eyes were open, fixed on me, and they were filled with a terrifying mixture of hope and fear. He was laying himself bare, and he was waiting for me to do the same. I thought about all my rules, all my carefully built walls. They were useless now. He was already inside. He had been for a long time. The choice before me was simple, and it was impossible. I could lie, give him some easy, platonic answer that would defuse the situation, preserve our friendship, and send me back to the safety of my emotional fortress. Or I could tell the truth. Not the whole, overwhelming tidal wave of it, but a piece of it. A single, honest drop of water. I could open the door just a crack and let him see inside. It was the biggest risk I had ever faced. Losing him was my greatest fear, but I was suddenly gripped by a new one. The fear of living the rest of my life in that fortress, alone, knowing that I had been offered a key and had been too afraid to take it. His fingers tightened ever so slightly on my leg, a silent plea for an answer. I took a breath, the air feeling sharp and cold in my lungs. I turned my head to meet his gaze in the flickering twilight of the room. The night that everything finally broke was different from the start. A storm had been brewing all day, the sky a bruised, heavy purple. The air was thick with ozone and anticipation. Liam had spent the afternoon in his room, the door closed. I had heard him on the phone with his former boss, a tense, clipped conversation that ended with him saying, "No, I understand. It's just, never mind." When he emerged, his face was a mask of weary resignation. The last, flickering ember of hope that his project might be revived in some form had finally been extinguished. He didn't say a word, just drifted into the living room and sank into his usual spot on the couch, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The space he took up seemed to be shrinking, collapsing inward under the weight of his disappointment. That evening, our ritual felt less like a comfort and more like a necessity. The silence in the apartment was heavy, charged by the impending storm outside. We didn't even bother with the television. We just sat in the dim light of the single lamp, the windows slowly growing dark. I was at my end, he was at his, and the couch was the life raft we were both clinging to. He curled up almost immediately, his back to the room, facing the cushions. I assumed he was shutting down, retreating into himself. But after a few minutes, he rolled over to face me. His eyes were open, stark and clear in the low light. There was no sleepiness in them, no haze of exhaustion. They were just present, and they were fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. He didn't touch me. He just watched me. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant rumble of thunder. I felt pinned by his gaze, every secret I had ever kept feeling exposed and vulnerable. I wanted to look away, to retreat behind the cover of my book, but I couldn't. It felt like he was seeing me for the first time, not as a roommate or a friend or a convenient source of comfort, but as me, Ethan, the quiet observer who had been watching him for years. The storm broke then. A sudden crack of thunder directly overhead made the windows rattle, and at the same moment, the rain began to fall in a torrential downpour, a solid wall of sound that insulated us from the rest of the world. The room, our little island in the storm, suddenly felt impossibly intimate. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. His voice was raw, barely audible over the roar of the rain. My heart seized. This was it. He was going to end it. He was going to say this strange, ambiguous intimacy had to stop, that he needed space, that he was putting the walls back up. I braced myself for the impact. "Do what?" I managed to ask, my own voice tight. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us, at the couch, at the whole unspoken arrangement. Pretending. Pretending I'm just tired. Pretending I don't know what I'm doing. He took a shaky breath. Every night, I tell myself it's the last time. That it's not fair to you. That I'm just using you to feel less alone. But then the next night comes, and I can't. I can't stay in my own room. It feels empty. The silence is too loud in there. It's only quiet in here. With you. Every word was a revelation, dismantling my carefully constructed theories one by one. He wasn't unconscious of his actions. He wasn't just using me as a generic source of comfort. He was aware. He knew. And he was just as conflicted as I was. The photograph in the developer tray was suddenly coming into sharp, shocking focus. "Ethan," he said, his voice dropping even lower, laced with a vulnerability that broke my heart. "Can I ask you something?" I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. Can I stay with you tonight? In your room? In your bed?" He rushed the words out, as if afraid they would die on his tongue if he spoke them too slowly. I don't want to be alone. Not tonight. And I don't want to be on this couch. I don't want to be in this gray area. I just want." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I understood. He wanted a real space. A definite space. Not the ambiguous territory of the living room, but a room with a door that could be closed. An intentional space. This was the moment. The precipice. The question I had been asked before, "Do you think about me?" was a philosophical one. This was a practical one. A logistical one. A choice with immediate, physical consequences. All my rules, all my self-preservation instincts, screamed at me to say no. To protect myself. To tell him it was a bad idea. That we should keep our boundaries. But looking at his face, at the raw, desperate plea in his eyes, I knew I couldn't. The fortress I had built to protect my heart suddenly felt like a prison. And he was standing at the gate, asking to be let in. "Okay," I said. The word was small, but it felt like the loudest sound I had ever made. "Yes. Okay." Relief washed over his face, so potent it was like watching the sun rise after a long night. He didn't smile, but the tension in his jaw, in his shoulders, eased. The journey from the couch to my bedroom was the longest 10 feet I have ever traveled. It felt like a walk through a new and foreign country. I was acutely aware of him behind me, of the sound of his socked feet on the hardwood floor. My room was simple. A bed, a desk with my equipment, and prints, my own work, tacked to the walls. It was the most personal space I had, the inner sanctum of the fortress. And I had just invited him in. I pulled back the comforter on my bed, the simple action feeling monumental. He hesitated in the doorway, that architectural symbol of a threshold, a boundary. For a moment, I thought he would change his mind, retreat back to the safety of the known world. But then he stepped inside and quietly closed the door behind him. The click of the latch was a definitive sound. It separated us from the rest of the apartment, from the rest of the world. We were in a new space now, a space with new rules that neither of us knew. We got into the bed, one on each side, a chasm of clean sheets between us. We lay on our backs, staring up at the ceiling, where the faint light from the street lamp outside cast shifting shadows of rain on the window. The roar of the storm was more muffled in here, a distant, soothing rumble. For minutes, we didn't speak. We just breathed in the quiet, charged air. This was so much more terrifying than the couch. There was no plausible deniability here. There was no pretense of sleep. We were both wide awake, and we were both here by choice. Finally, he turned his head on the pillow to look at me. "Ethan." "Yeah," I whispered, not daring to look at him yet. "Would it be okay," he started, his voice barely a tremor, "if I kissed you?" And there it was. The final question. The one that left no room for ambiguity, no place to hide. It was a question born not of confidence or seduction, but of a deep, profound vulnerability. He wasn't assuming, he was asking. He was giving me all the power. He was handing me the key to everything and trusting me not to lock him out. I finally turned to face him. In the gloom, his eyes were dark pools of sincerity, of fear, of a hope so fragile I felt I could break it by breathing too loudly. The tidal wave I had been holding back for 4 years finally breached the dam. But it wasn't a destructive force. It was a quiet, warm flood of relief, of certainty. I didn't answer with a word. I just closed the small distance between us and gently pressed my lips against his. The kiss was not what I had imagined in 1,000 secret daydreams. It was not passionate or demanding. It was tentative, It was soft. It was a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of rain and salt, the storm outside, and the unshed tears on his own lips. It was a kiss of profound, earth-shattering relief. It was the feeling of coming home after a lifetime of being lost. When we broke apart, we just looked at each other, our faces inches apart. He reached up and gently, so gently, cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. A small, shaky smile touched his lips. "Oh," he breathed, as if a great mystery had just been solved. "It's you." I didn't understand what he meant at first, but then he elaborated, his voice full of wonder. All this time, this restlessness, this feeling that something was missing, I kept looking for it. In work, in other people. I never. It was you. It was always you. Right here. He closed his eyes, a real smile finally reaching them. "I'm so stupid." "No, you're not," I whispered, my own voice thick with emotion. I covered his hand with mine, pressing his palm more firmly against my skin. "You were just lost." "I was," he agreed, his eyes opening again. "And you were my North Star, and I was too busy looking at the map to just look up." He shifted closer, closing the last of the space between us, and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me against his chest. I buried my face in the crook of his neck, breathing in the familiar, beloved scent of him, and for the first time, I didn't have to hold back. I wrapped my own arms around him, holding on tight, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my ear. The storm raged outside, but in here, in this small, quiet space we had finally created, there was only peace. The morning after was a study in quiet terror. I woke up slowly, drawn from sleep by the pale, rain-washed light filtering through the blinds. For a moment, I was disoriented, my body suffused with a warmth and a sense of peace that was utterly foreign. Then memory returned, flooding me in a dizzying rush. The storm, the confession, the kiss. Liam. I turned my head, a smile already forming on my lips, expecting to see him there beside me. The space was empty. The sheet on his side of the bed was cold. A knot of pure ice formed in my stomach. I sat up, my heart starting a frantic, panicked rhythm. His pillow still held the faint indentation of his head. Otherwise, there was no sign he had ever been there. I listened. The apartment was silent. Too silent. I threw back the covers and walked out into the living room. The couch was neat, the blanket folded on the armchair. The whole apartment had a sterile, untouched feel to it. His door was closed. I stood in the hallway, that liminal space between our two worlds, and I just stared at the flat, white plane of his door. It was a wall, a barrier. All the warmth and intimacy of the night before seemed to have evaporated with the morning light, leaving behind a cold, clinical reality. I was a fool, a complete and utter fool. The cautious, veteran side of my heart, the one I had ignored, was now screaming, "I told you so." He had been hurt, vulnerable, desperate for comfort. I wasn't his North Star. I was a momentary flicker of light in his darkness. I was a bandage for a wound. And now that the immediate pain had subsided, he had ripped the bandage off and retreated, horrified by the intimacy, by the line he had crossed in a moment of weakness. The shame was a physical heat on my skin. I had let him in. I had let down all my defenses for him, and he had fled at the first light of day. I felt used. I felt naive. The beautiful, fragile thing we had created in the storm had been shattered by the harsh light of morning. I retreated to my own room and closed the door. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want to face the awkward, pitying look in his eyes. I spent the day in a haze of misery, editing photos with a mechanical detachment, the images on my screen a meaningless blur of pixels. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway sent a jolt of anxiety through me. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A text from him. "Hey, had to run out early for a thing. Sorry I didn't say bye." A thing. The monumental, life-altering night we had shared was reduced to a thing. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. I didn't reply. An hour later, another text. "Listen, about last night." I stared at the three dots as he typed, my blood running cold. Here it comes. The apology. I was confused. The "let's just be friends" the sentence that finally appeared was worse. "I think I need some space to figure things out." Space. He was in the same apartment, 10 feet away, and he was asking for space. It was a rejection so total, so absolute, that it felt like a physical blow. The fortress I had so foolishly abandoned was in ruins, and I was standing in the rubble, completely exposed. The next few days were a special kind of hell. We were ghosts in our own home, communicating through terse text messages and post-it notes on the fridge. We timed our movements to avoid each other. If I heard his door open, I would wait until he was in the kitchen and gone before I emerged from my room. The comfortable silence we once shared had become a thick, suffocating tension. The air was charged with everything that was unsaid. His retreat was so complete, it was like he was trying to erase the last few months, to erase the night in my room, to erase me. The pain of it was a dull, constant ache. But underneath the pain, a new emotion began to smolder: anger. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for his inability to face what he had done, what he had asked for. But mostly, I was angry at myself. I was angry for reverting to my old role, the quiet observer. I had allowed him to define the narrative, to retreat, and leave me in this agonizing limbo. I had spent years being passive, and my one act of courage had led to this disaster. And I realized, with a sickening clarity, that if I let this continue, our friendship, the very thing I had been trying to protect for so long, would die a slow, silent death from this poison of unspoken words. It was already dying. Maybe it was already dead. After a week of this silent, cold war, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I had to hear it from him, face to face. I had to make him look at me and tell me what last night had meant, even if the answer destroyed me. At least the uncertainty would be over. I waited until I heard him come home that evening. I listened to his movements, the drop of his keys in the bowl by the door, the soft sigh as he took off his shoes. I took a deep breath, opened my door, and stepped into the hallway just as he was about to retreat into his own room. He froze, his hand on his doorknob, like a startled animal. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at a point on the wall somewhere over my shoulder. "Hey," he mumbled. "Liam," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "We need to talk. I'm really tired, Ethan. Can we do this later?" It was a weak deflection, and we both knew it. "No," I said, and I took a step closer, forcing him to acknowledge my presence. "We're doing this now. You don't get to do what you did and then just disappear. You don't get to open a door and then pretend it doesn't exist." I was using our old metaphor, the architecture of it all. "You asked to come in, so you don't get to stand in the hallway now." He finally looked at me, and his face was a wreck of conflict. He looked exhausted, yes, but he also looked scared, terrified. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said, his voice strained. "I want you to say the truth." I shot back, my voice rising with the anger and hurt I had been suppressing all week. What was last week about? What was any of this about? The couch? Coming to my room? Kissing me? Was that all just the cure for loneliness? Was I just a convenient, warm body for you while you were feeling sorry for yourself? Because if that's all it was, you owe me the decency of saying it to my face. He flinched as if I had struck him. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, it wasn't that. It wasn't." "Then what was it, Liam?" I demanded, stepping even closer, closing the space between us until we were standing almost toe-to-toe in the narrow hallway. "Because you kissed me like you meant it. You held me like you were never going to let go. And then you vanished. You treated me like a dirty secret, like a mistake you had to erase. So you have to tell me which one was the lie. The man in my bed that night? Or the ghost who's been haunting this apartment all week? Which one is you?" He finally broke. He slumped against his door, his face crumbling. "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "God, Ethan, I don't know." He covered his face with his hands. "When I'm with you, especially that night, everything makes sense. It felt right. More right than anything has ever felt. I wasn't pretending. I wasn't using you. It was real. All of it." "Then why?" I asked, my anger deflating, replaced by a wave of confusion and a flicker of that old, stubborn hope. "Why did you run?" He dropped his hands and looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Because it's you," he said, echoing his words from that night. But this time they were filled with panic instead of wonder. "Because you're a man. And I've never. My whole life, I've had this plan. This picture of what my life was supposed to look like. The job, the house, the wife, the kids. It's a system. I build systems, it's what I do. And you don't fit in the system. You break it. And it terrifies me." He took a ragged breath. "I woke up that morning, and I felt this peace. This incredible, quiet peace. And it scared me more than the failure, more than the loneliness. Because it was a peace I had never planned for. And my first thought was that I was going to ruin you. That I was confused, and I was going to drag you into my mess and hurt you. So I ran. I thought if I put distance between us, the feeling would fade. I thought I could put it back in its box. But it's not fading. It's getting worse. The silence is louder than ever. And I miss you. God, I miss you so much it hurts. His confession hung in the air between us, raw and honest and messy. All my anger evaporated, replaced by a profound, aching tenderness. He hadn't run from me. He had run from himself. He had run from a feeling so new and so powerful it threatened to rewrite everything he thought he knew about his own life. He hadn't been trying to erase me. He had been trying, and failing, to erase a part of himself he had just discovered. He wasn't a coward. He was just lost and scared. I saw in his eyes the same fear I had lived with for years. The fear of the unknown, the fear of risking everything for a feeling you can't explain. I reached out, my hand hesitating for a moment before I gently placed it on his arm. He didn't pull away. He leaned into the touch, a sob catching in his throat. Liam, I said, my voice soft now. You don't have a system. You have a life. And life doesn't follow a flowchart. It's messy. It's unpredictable. And it's okay to be scared. But what if I hurt you? He whispered, his gaze searching mine. What if I'm still just confused? What if you don't? I countered gently. We've been living in the gray area for months. We tried the silence. We tried the distance. It's not working. Maybe we should try the truth. I looked from his eyes to his lips and back again. I'm scared too. But I'm more scared of this, I said, gesturing to the empty, silent space around us. I'm more scared of losing you to this fear. He stared at me for a long, silent moment, his expression shifting from fear to a fragile, dawning resolution. He slowly, tentatively, reached up and covered my hand with his own. His touch was no longer ambiguous. It was a choice. Okay, he whispered, his voice thick. Okay, let's try the truth. That conversation in the hallway was not an end, but a beginning. It was the demolition of the old, broken structures and the laying of a new, honest foundation. There were no more grand, cinematic moments after that. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that felt clean and quiet and new. The healing, the real building, happened in the small, mundane moments that followed. It happened in the way he started leaving his bedroom door open, not just a crack, but wide open, an invitation into his space that was no longer fraught with ambiguity. It happened in the way I could walk into his room while he was working and just sit with him in a comfortable silence that was no longer a substitute for words, but a shared peace that didn't require them. We talked. We really talked, for hours, spread over days and nights. He talked about the suffocating pressure of the life he had planned for himself, a blueprint drawn by expectations, his parents', society's, his own, that he had never thought to question. He spoke of the loneliness that permeated his jet-setting career, the feeling of being a visitor in his own life, and how our quiet apartment had become the only real place he had. I talked too. I finally, haltingly, confessed the true depth and breadth of my feelings for him, the years of quiet observation from behind my self-imposed walls. I explained the rules I had made for myself, the fortress I had built, and how his pain had been the thing that had finally, mercifully, breached its defenses. It was like developing an old, forgotten roll of film. We held our shared history up to the light, and for the first time, we saw the same image, clear and true. The couch became our space again, but it was transformed. The anxiety was gone. The hyperanalysis of every touch was gone. It was no longer a place of desperate, unspoken need. It was simply a place of comfort. One evening, a few weeks after our talk, we were sitting there, watching a movie. He was leaning against me, his head on my shoulder, his hand resting on my chest, right over my heart. It was a pose that would have once sent my own heart into a frantic, panicked spiral. Now it was just calm. My heart beat slow and steady under his palm. He shifted, tilting his head up to look at me. "Do you think about me?" he asked softly. The question was the same one that had shattered my world weeks before. But this time, the tone was entirely different. It wasn't a desperate plea from the darkness. It was a soft, playful, confident question from someone who already knew the answer. It was a shared secret, a line from the first act of our play that we could now look back on with a tender, knowing nostalgia. I smiled, a real, easy smile. I leaned down and kissed him, a slow, gentle kiss that was full of the quiet certainty we had built together. All the time, I whispered against his lips, "I think about what you want for dinner. I think about the ridiculous way your hair sticks up in the morning. I think about the fact that you still, after all these years, can't manage to load the dishwasher correctly." He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that filled the room. It was the sound I had missed more than anything. "Hey, I have a system for the dishwasher." "I know," I said, laughing with him. "That's the problem." I settled back against the cushions, and he rested his head back on my shoulder, his arm tightening around me. We didn't need a system anymore. We didn't need a blueprint. We were learning to navigate by a different kind of light, the steady, quiet glow of what we were building together day by day. It wasn't a pre-planned architecture. It was something more organic, more alive. It was like a garden we were learning to tend together. We were planting seeds of trust and honesty, watering them with patience, and pulling the weeds of fear and misunderstanding when they appeared. Some days were sunny, some were overcast, but we were in it together, our hands in the same soil. We learned to create a new kind of silence. It wasn't the empty silence of absence or the tense silence of unspoken feelings. It was a full silence, a silence that was rich with understanding and acceptance. It was the silence of me working in my darkroom with the door open, knowing he was just in the next room. It was the silence of us reading in the same bed at night, our shoulders just touching, each lost in our own world but completely, securely aware of the other. It was the silence of making coffee together in the morning, a slow, easy dance in the small kitchen that needed no choreography. We had spent so long trying to interpret the noise, the subtext, the gestures, the ambiguous signals. We had finally learned that the most important things were communicated in the quiet. The truest intimacy wasn't in the grand confessions, but in the peaceful, shared space between the words. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and you don't recognize their importance until much later, when you look back and see them as the clear, solid foundation upon which your new reality is built. That night on the couch, with his hand on my leg and his whispered question in the air, was not the end of my loneliness or the beginning of a perfect romance. It was something far more important. It was the moment the first crack appeared in the walls we had both built around our hearts. It was the tremor that signaled the impending, necessary collapse of the lives we thought we were supposed to live, making way for the life that was actually waiting for us. It was the start of a long, slow, and beautiful demolition. And in the quiet, open space that was left behind, in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we finally began to build a home.